Number 60, Kevin Nash. Kevin Nash had a lot of different looks in his day: the Master Blaster, Oz, Vinny Vegas, and so on. In 1993, the big man would make his way to the World Wrestling Federation as Diesel, and before long would become one of the biggest stars in company history. One of the longest reigning world champions of the modern era, Nash would achieve even greater fame in WCW, where he and Scott Hall helped kick the Monday Night War into another gear. One of the founding members of the New World Order, Nash would eventually become the booker for the company, the merits of which are still being argued. Since WCW's closure, Big Sexy's made several sporadic appearances for WWE, including for a short-lived revival of the NWO. Number 59, Jeff Jarrett. In the annals of pro wrestling history, there are few people who have endured quite like Double J has. Starting his career in Nashville, in his father's territory, Jeff Jarrett would eventually get the chance to prove himself in the Federation in a few different stints during the 90s. He was a perennial contender for the Intercontinental title before returning to WCW in 1999. While there, he would achieve the level of success some say he didn't get a chance to have in the Federation, becoming a multiple-time WCW champion. After the company folded, Jeff and his father Jerry created TNA, where he would have several more years of main event dominance as the NWA World's Champion. Long considered a man who would never get into the Hall of Fame, his induction in 2018 is considered one of the most shocking in recent memory. Number 58, Rick Rude. One of the best bodies and best mustaches to ever grace the squared circle, Rick Rude cut his teeth in the Southern Territories before making his way to the WWF, where he joined the Heenan family. His early feuds with Jake the Snake and the Ultimate Warrior were among his most famous, and though he had to retire from in-ring competition in 1994 due to injury, he'd remain a prominent on-screen presence, whether in WCW, the WWF, or ECW, sometimes more than one of those in a single night. He was also a founding member of the Hall of Fame stable D-Generation X, as well as the first DXer to become a member of the NWO. Number 57, Diamond Dallas Page. It's safe to say that Diamond Dallas Page was a late bloomer in the world of wrestling. Getting a start in the AWA in 1988 as a manager, DDP had his first match 1 year later at the age of 33. Page would join WCW in 1991 and would remain a fixture there until the company's buyout a decade later. Though his time in WWE is better left kept unmentioned, he's earned the respect of the business in retirement through his yoga and lifestyle program. Through DDP Yoga, many superstars and civilians alike have been able to drastically alter their lives for the better, even helping men like Scott Hall and Jake Roberts kick their infamous reputations and live clean, prosperous lives in recovery. Number 56, Trish Stratus. A former fitness model, Trish Stratus was brought into the company at a time when talent wasn't a requirement to get signed, but by the time she retired in 2006, she became a revolutionary force in the women's division. Beginning as a valet for Test and Albert, their feud with the Hardy Boys would pave the way for the rivalry between Trish and Lita, which would be an on-again, off-again relationship between the two for the remainder of their careers. Trish would go on to be the focal point of the women's scene throughout the 2000s, feuding with Mickie James, Molly Holly, and others, winning the women's championship 7 times along the way, even returning in 2018 for the first ever Women's Royal Rumble as entrant 30, and teaming with her longtime rival at the company's first all-women's pay-per-view, Evolution. Number 55, Stan Hansen. Arguably the most well-known cowboy in professional wrestling, Stan Hansen's become a legend not just in America, but around the world. Getting a start tagging with Bruiser Brody in the NWA, Hansen would soon move to the Worldwide Wrestling Federation and cement his place as public enemy number 1 by breaking Bruno Sammartino's neck in their title match. Hansen would achieve what many consider his greatest success in Japan in the 1980s, working for both All Japan and New Japan. With a lariat like his, there's no surprise he was so well received in the land of the rising sun. Hansen would have a brief run in the AWA and WCW before going back to Japan to finish out his career, wrestling from 91 till 2000 for All Japan Pro Wrestling, and would remain an influential figure in the company until his full retirement in 2007. Number 54, Mad Dog Vachon. A standout member of a wrestling family, Mad Dog Vachon first made his name as an amateur wrestler, representing Canada in the 1948 Olympics, as well as winning the gold medal at the British Empire Games. He'd move to the pro ranks and make his name as the top heel with the AWA, winning their world championship 5 times in his tenure, perfecting his rough, brutal in-ring style that would later be adopted by the likes of Bruiser Brody and George the Animal Steele. Though he'd have a very short run in the Federation during the mid-80s, he would return for In Your House 7, where his artificial leg would be used as a weapon between Shawn Michaels and Diesel, and his legacy would continue to live through his niece, the late Luna Vachon. Number 53, the Von Erich family. They say everything's bigger in Texas, and in the territory days, there was no family in Texas bigger than the Von Erichs. The Von Erich clan was led by patriarch Fritz, real name Jack Atkinson, who originally made his name playing a German heel in the NWA and is also credited with helping rebuild the Japanese wrestling scene after the death of Ricky Dozan. As president of World Class Championship Wrestling in the Dallas-Fort Worth area, Fritz helped his boys Kevin, Kerry, David, Chris, and Mike become local and national celebrities in the business. Unfortunately, the Von Erichs are as well known for their tragic story as they are for their in-ring exploits, as all but one of Fritz's sons have passed away over the years due to awful circumstances. Despite this, the Von Erich name continues to live on with the third generation of talent, Michael, Ross, and Lacey. Number 52, Tatsumi Fujinami. Tatsumi Fujinami never had an exclusive run in the WWF, but his influence is felt even today in the international scene. Arriving in the US in the late 70s, Fujinami won the WWF Light Heavyweight Championship and turned it into the premier title of its kind in Japan. In 1990, Fujinami defeated Ric Flair to become the first man to simultaneously hold the IWGP and NWA Heavyweight Championships, though that lineage has been called into question. While this would be his only NWA Heavyweight Championship reign, he would hold the IWGP title 6 times, several tag championships, and would become one of the most important ambassadors for WWE in Japan following his Hall of Fame induction in 2015. Number 51, Ron Simmons. A two-time All-American for Florida State and Collegiate Hall of Famer, Ron Simmons came to prominence in Jim Crockett Promotions. Achieving early success with Butch Reed as the tag team Doom, the two would split in the early 90s, and in 1992, Simmons made history by becoming the first officially recognized African-American world champion in professional wrestling. Though he was never able to achieve that same level of single success in the Federation, he was able to leave a lasting impression on fans, whether it be in blue armor as Farouk Assad, as the leader of the Nation of Domination, or as one half of the APA, where he became a 3-time tag champion with Bradshaw. Number 50, the Hart Foundation. Forming in 1985, brothers-in-law Bret Hart and Jim Neidhart were the standard for what a well-rounded tag team should look like. Combining the Anvil's freakish strength and the Hitman's technical prowess, along with Jimmy Hart at ringside, the team was one of the most dominant of the 1980s. They'd win the tag team championships twice and feud with other all-time greats such as Demolition, the British Bulldogs, and the Rockers. Hart and Neidhart would split amicably following WrestleMania 7, allowing Bret to catapult to singles superstardom. Number 49, Gene Okerlund. As the company's longtime interviewer, Mean Gene Okerlund was one of the most prominent figures in the WWF during the height of their power. Though he wasn't a wrestler, Okerlund was as synonymous with the company as Hulk Hogan, Randy Savage, or the Ultimate Warrior. Okerlund got his start in radio before moving to the AWA and eventually making his way to the Federation, where his voice would reverberate in the minds of fans for years to come. Despite making the jump to WCW in 1993, he was welcomed back with open arms following the buyout and was a beloved member of the production team until his passing in early 2019. Number 48, Tito Santana. Arguably the biggest Latino superstar and perennial babyface during the rise of the World Wrestling Federation, Tito Santana was a dominant personality in the 1980s and maintained that prominence going into the 90s. A 2-time Intercontinental Champion and the first Mexican-American star to hold the gold, he famously feuded with the likes of Don Barranco, Greg the Hammer Valentine, and Macho Man Randy Savage. Santana was also one of the earliest ECW champions, holding the title while it was still Eastern Championship Wrestling, reigned as 1989 King of the Ring, and remains a part of the independent scene to this very day. Number 47, the Road Warriors. Hawk and Animal brought a rush of excitement to every territory they visited in their lengthy career. Alongside their manager Paul Ellering, the duo were a powerhouse throughout the NWA, AWA, and WCW, even becoming international successes in Japan. Their brief runs in the Federation as the Legion of Doom during the 90s resulted in a pair of tag team championship reigns. Though the team would go through a few incarnations with a rotating roster, none would ever capture the mystique, the intensity, and the sheer charisma of the original duo. Number 46, Larry Zbyszko. One of the original students of Bruno Sammartino, Larry Zbyszko got his start in the WWF in the 70s. He made a name for himself by turning his back on his former mentor and engaging in a bloody rivalry that ended in a steel cage match at Shea Stadium in 1980. Zbyszko would spend time in the NWA, and in a stunt that predates a similar event by Ted DiBiase by several years, bought the national championship from Tim Brooks, had it taken away from him, then won it back in a tournament. Zbyszko continued to ply his craft in the AWA all the way up to its closure in the early 90s as their final champion. The living legend would finish his competitive career in WCW, and later joined TNA as an on-air personality, where he stayed until 2006. Number 45, the Rock and Roll Express. Though their runs in the World Wrestling Federation were limited in scope, that shouldn't take away from the fact that the Rock and Roll Express are one of the most influential tag teams in history. As staples of the territory system and the NWA, the pair of Robert Gibson and Ricky Morton secured tag team gold wherever they went and had memorable feuds with the likes of the Heavenly Bodies, the Midnight Express, and the Midnight Rockers, who had borrowed part of their name from that group. Number 44, Curt Hennig. Arguably one of the greatest performers to never hold the top prize in the WWF, Curt Hennig was still the perfect competitor. Getting a start in the AWA and holding their heavyweight championship as well as their tag team championship, his move to New York would see him immortalized in some of the most famous vignettes ever produced by the company, and he'd work in the ring every night to prove himself worthy of the moniker Mr. Perfect. He'd go on to capture the Intercontinental Championship twice and held WCW's US title. He even had a brief run in TNA before his unfortunate passing in 2003 at the age of 44. Number 43, Antonio Inoki. When it comes to WWE, Antonio Inoki's most direct involvement in the company is having been declared an unofficial world champion after beating Bob Backlund in Japan back in 1979. Oh yes, he also held the World Martial Arts Heavyweight Championship for 11 years. But on a larger scale, Inoki is considered one of the godfathers of Japanese wrestling. A student of Riki Dozan who also trained alongside Giant Baba, Inoki founded New Japan Pro Wrestling in 1972, which he ran all the way up until 2005. One of his highest profile bouts was the aforementioned battle against Muhammad Ali in 1976. He also took part in the main event of the famous Collision in Korea event against Ric Flair in 1995. Perhaps more important than his in-ring accomplishments, though, is his lasting impact on wrestling as a whole. Having learned under Karl Gotch, Antonio was one of the first people to introduce what's become known as strong style to a wider audience, which fans of today's Puroresu thank him for to this day. Number 42, Nick Bockwinkel. One of the best athletes of his day, Nick Bockwinkel was a master technician who had an incredible grasp on psychology and wrestling. Spending his early years working up and down the west coast of America as well as Hawaii, it was his time in Georgia where he grew to become a main event star, occasionally challenging for the NWA World title. By 1970, Bockwinkel made his way to the AWA where he won tag team gold on 3 occasions before going solo once again. At the age of 40, he snapped Vern Gagne's 7-year reign as the AWA champion, then went on to hold it for an equally impressive 5 years before dropping it back to Vern. It would be the first of his 4 world titles. Along with his fantastic in-ring prowess, Bockwinkel was also known for his intelligent promo style, speaking calmly, wearing nice suits, and casually dropping 2-bit words in his promos. It was a style that would greatly influence Chris Jericho during his successful heel run in the late 2000s. Bockwinkel would give back to the business long after retirement, including having backstage and on-air roles in the Federation and WCW, as well as serving as the president of the Cauliflower Alley Club. Number 41, Jerry Lawler. Jerry Lawler has worn many hats in wrestling over the decades, having worked as a wrestler, announcer, and a booker. One of the most talented talkers in the business, Lawler's truly treated like royalty in his hometown of Memphis, where he spent a large portion of his career. But more so than his feuds with guys like Austin Idol, Bill Dundee, and Jackie Fargo, and more than his ridiculous number of title victories, he's perhaps best known for his feud with comedian Andy Kaufman in 1982. Lawler was the ultimate hero, standing up to Kaufman's obnoxious posturing and his love of wrestling women. It was the first angle of its kind to heavily involve a celebrity outside of the realm of pro wrestling, and was heavily featured in the Kaufman biopic Man on the Moon, in which Lawler played himself. As a booker, he's been known for some laughably bad gimmicks, and his work on color commentary over the years have drawn a wide range of reactions, from hysterical laughter to eye-rolling groans. But for his longevity and his accomplishments in the ring, the King's done more than enough to be a Hall of Famer. Number 40, the Fabulous Moolah. The first female inducted into the Hall of Fame, the Fabulous Moolah got her start in 1949 before making her way to Vince McMahon Sr.'s Capitol Wrestling in 1955. There she began her decades-long dominance in women's wrestling after winning a battle royal to become the women's champion. That first reign would last for 10 years. Moolah is also noteworthy for helping to overturn a statewide ban on women's wrestling in New York, and she became one of the first women allowed to wrestle in Madison Square Garden. Eventually, Moolah literally and legally owned the title she held for so long, which may explain why she had such a stranglehold on it. Moolah would keep wrestling well into her 70s, even going so far as to win the women's championship from Ivory in 1999. Though her impact and her level of control on women's wrestling has been looked at poorly in hindsight, for better or for worse, the history of women's wrestling in America runs right through the Fabulous Moolah. Number 39, Ted DiBiase. Getting his start in the Mid-South as well as building his repertoire in Japan, Ted DiBiase debuted as the $1 Million Man in the Federation and made an instant impact. His vignettes were unforgettable as he'd use cash to get himself out of any minor inconvenience possible. His time in the company would see him involved in many feuds for the championship against guys like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man Randy Savage. DiBiase would also become the 1988 King of the Ring as well as a 3-time tag team champion with IRS. But perhaps his most lasting legacy would be his $1 Million Championship, a belt created for him when he was unable to buy the World Championship. The value of having your own trademark title that's forever associated with you is simply priceless. Number 38, Killer Kowalski. Born Edward Spolnick in 1926, Killer Kowalski first broke onto the scene at the age of 21. Initially going by many names in his early years, the Killer nickname stuck after an incident in 1952 that saw him sever Yukon Erich's cauliflower ear after hitting a knee drop, cementing his reputation as a sadistic competitor. In the Worldwide Wrestling Federation, Kowalski tried and failed multiple times to win the world title from Bruno Sammartino and later Pedro Morales, but he was more successful in the tag team ranks, holding the company's US tag titles once with Gorilla Monsoon, and then the World Tag titles with Big John Studd under masks as the Executioners. Kowalski's legacy has lived on in the wrestlers he has trained. His most famous graduates include Perry Saturn, Matt Bloom, Chyna, and some guy named Paul. Number 37, The Funks. Two brothers, two former NWA World Heavyweight Champions. For the last 5 decades, Terry and Dory Funk Jr. have left their mark on professional wrestling like a cattle brand from the Double Cross Ranch. Though their run of the Federation during the 80s didn't set the world on fire, their other exploits outside the company are what made the duo so legendary. Dory's legacy not only comes from his in-ring accolades, but also his experience as a trainer. Since running the Funkin' Conservatory out of Florida, his most prominent graduates include the Hardy Boys, Edge and Christian, Kurt Angle, Test, and Mickey James. As for Terry, the Funker's style evolved as he got older, changing to more of a hardcore brawler. This parlayed well into his later runs in Japan, taking part in Japanese death matches against his protege Cactus Jack, as well as his involvement in ECW, where his presence added incredible legitimacy to the organization. The man with more false retirements than Ric Flair is still occasionally performing today, well into his 70s. Number 36, Jimmy Snuka. A rare combination of size, strength, and agility, Jimmy Snuka is often credited with helping introduce a high-flying style to the World Wrestling Federation. Despite spending only 3 years with the company in his prime, Snuka soon became one of the most beloved characters in the company after originally debuting as a villainous fighter. Though his popularity had arguably peaked before the arrival of Hulk Hogan, Snuka was such a big deal he was brought in as the corner man for Hogan and Mr. T in the main event of the first WrestleMania. Besides being on the receiving end of a coconut blast from Roddy Piper, Snuka's most iconic moment in the company was his dramatic Superfly splash off the top of a steel cage onto Don Morocco at Madison Square Garden in 1983. Some future stars were in attendance that October evening, all claiming that match gave them the flash of inspiration needed to pursue careers in pro wrestling. Mick Foley, Tommy Dreamer, The Sandman, and Bubba Ray Dudley. And here's some trivia for you. Snuka was also the first victim of The Undertaker's WrestleMania streak in 1991. Number 35, Pedro Morales. Remember way back in the first video of this series when I mentioned how the WWF basically had a wrestler for every nationality? Well, Pedro Morales filled the Puerto Rican quota, and he did it pretty well. One of the top baby faces in the company's history, Morales had an aura about him that fans seemed to gravitate to no matter their race. Making his in-ring debut back in 1959, Morales cut his teeth working all across the United States before finally landing in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation in 1970. In '73, he became the first Latino superstar to win the company's World Championship and go on to hold it for nearly 3 years straight, the longest reign for a one-time champion and the 5th longest all time. After spending several years in San Francisco, the AWA, Florida, and Japan, Morales would make a triumphant return to the Federation in the early 80s, where he'd go on to claim more gold. By winning the tag team titles with Bob Backlund and later the Intercontinental title from Ken Patera, Morales became the first ever Triple Crown winner in WWE history. Number 34, Curt Angle. Kurt Angle is quite possibly the greatest wrestler to ever make the switch from Olympic wrestling to the pros. After winning the gold medal for the USA in 1996, Angle spent a couple of years looking at his options before the World Wrestling Federation came calling. A natural talent, Kurt got one of the biggest, fastest pushes to the top in company history, winning the World Championship in his first year on television. With his insane drive, unmatched work ethic, and his natural charisma, Angle became one of the most beloved competitors of the modern era, able to play both babyface and heel with ease. Since that that first year, Angle's become one of the most decorated wrestlers of all time, winning more than a dozen world championships across WWE and Impact, as well as the IWGP Third Belt Championship. Even if you don't include his exploits after first leaving WWE more than a decade ago, Angle's time in the company has truly been Hall of Fame worthy. It's true. Number 33, Gorilla Monsoon. One of the earliest and most popular examples of a wrestler transitioning to a broadcast role, Gorilla Monsoon made a name for himself for several decades in the business. After debuting as a proud Italian babyface named Gino Marella, he'd soon transform into Gorilla Monsoon, a wild savage Manchurian who spoke no English and ate raw meat. His wars with Bruno Sammartino were legendary, including one that went to a 90-minute time limit draw, and his partnership with the previously mentioned killer Kowalski was incredibly successful. Long before Muhammad Ali got involved in the first WrestleMania, he was the victim of a Gorilla Monsoon airplane spin after a match. Gino was one of the most despised wrestlers of the 60s, but after former rival Sammartino rescued him from an attack in 1969, he became one of the most beloved for several years. Monsoon was a made man of the company, owning a stake in the Worldwide Wrestling Federation before being bought out by Vince McMahon in 1982. He'd eventually retire from in-ring competition and make the move to announcer, backstage official, and later on-air president. His time as the voice of the company is considered by many fans to be some of the best commentary work the company's ever seen. Number 32, Classy Freddie Blassie. Whether as a wrestler or a manager, Freddie Blassie will always be known as one of the most hated men to set foot in a wrestling ring. Beginning his career all the way back in 1935, the fashion plate took a brief hiatus from the sport to serve in the U.S. Navy during World War II. Upon returning to the squared circle, Blassie would primarily work in the Los Angeles territory as well as Japan during the 60s, where he'd have a legendary feud with Ricky Dozan that helped build him up as a major star. In terms of getting heat, there are a few who could accomplish what Freddie did. According to legend, Blassie received multiple death threats, was stabbed dozens of times, and even had acid thrown at him over the years. After retiring from in-ring competition, Blassie would transition to managing in the WWF, where along with other managers like the Grand Wizard and Lou Albano, he'd find even more success. He led the Iron Sheik to the WWF Championship as well as to the tag titles with Nikolai Volkov. He even managed Muhammad Ali in his 1976 fight with Antonio Inoki in Japan, a bout that could best be described as underwhelming. After retiring from wrestling altogether in 1986, Blassie would make sporadic appearances with the company all the way until May of 2003, just 3 weeks before his death at the age of 85. Number 31, Ricky Steamboat. Ricky Steamboat has the unique distinction of having some of the best matches in company history across two different wrestling organizations. His classic with Randy Savage at WrestleMania 3, as well as any of his bouts with Ric Flair for the NWA World Championship in WCW in 1989. But beyond those two feuds, there's so much more to Steamboat's career. One of the top babyfaces in wrestling during the 80s and 90s, the Dragon was one of the most fluid and gifted athletes to ever grace the squared circle, winning the United States and NWA tag team titles multiple times. Not to mention, he was blessed with some of the prettiest arm drags in the business.